It has been my distinct pleasure to worship with Plymouth Congregational Church a number of times over the last several years. Recently, I refound this notebook. It had been lost in the chaos that surrounds moving and switching offices and things like that. This notebook, over a number of years, has just been a place where I have taken sermon notes, jotted down thoughts and ideas. And this is something, I picked up this notebook to jot down my sermon notes for today. And I didn't even notice this until just now on the platform here as I opened up this notebook of mine and paged through it. I saw a note, undoubtedly from a number of years ago, and Pastor Dwayne can confirm this. It just simply says, Plymouth Congregational Church, 10 lepers. And that's all it says. I don't remember whether this was a topic for a presentation or a commentary on the congregation itself. Some of you are nudging your partner right now saying, he's talking about you, you know. No, it has been my distinct pleasure to share space with this wonderful community of God. And it is my distinct honor and privilege to share this space with you again. I must admit, though, as I was preparing to write down my sermon, as I was preparing for my sermon today, I face a bit of a dilemma. You see, I don't regularly preach from a pulpit. I'm not a lead minister anywhere. I don't preach on a regular basis. I'm an itinerant preacher. I'm a guest preacher. I come into places and do pulpit supply. I'm invited in, that kind of thing. And see, when you're a guest preacher, there is a liberation in that. There is a freedom that comes with that. Because, quite honestly, I don't really have to be accountable to anything I say. I can come in, say whatever I want, and whatever mess is left in my wake is the responsibility of the pastor to take care of. But here's the problem. I like your pastor. As he's already mentioned, we have become dear friends. And so I am faced with not wanting to overburden him. So if I am going to continue, I need an assurance from you. You see, I'm kind of get this reputation for being a prophetic preacher, for coming in and telling people what they need to hear but might not want to hear. And it's hard for me to lay that down, even for friends. So the promise I need from you today is that if something that I say pricks you in a certain way, if something that I say gets you into your feelings, ruffles some feathers, don't bring it to your pastor. Please don't bring it to your pastor. Keep your drama to yourself. Work it out with fear and trembling. Can we agree on that? Okay, I'm going to hold you to that. You all don't know what you just agreed to. Undoubtedly, you have heard it said that by speakers or preachers, presenters, undoubtedly you have heard it said, if I have seen further than any other person, it is because I stand on the shoulders of giants. You've heard this. It is a common sentiment. I am here this morning to tell you that for me, that statement doesn't necessarily ring true. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not up here espousing my own grandiose self-importance. I'm not one of those, I'm a self-made man, I pulled myself up by my own bootstraps, I got here through no help of anyone else. I'm not that kind of person. But this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants doesn't quite hold true for me. You'll see why in a moment. Our text today is a clear call into how our posture as followers of Christ is to be as we follow a path into gospel living. It could not be more clear. Your attitude should be that as Christ, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking on human form, becoming a servant, obedient unto death, even death on a cross. Now, I must confess to you that as a pastor, a preacher, a shade tree theologian, about 70% of the time, I don't really like the Apostle Paul. For me, he's too heady, he's too academic, he's too philosophical. I'm a meat and potatoes kind of guy. I'm a pragmatic kind of guy. Every once in a while, though, Paul pens something that just really, really lands. And for me, this second chapter of Philippians is one of those passages. This is commonly known in theology world as the kenosis passage. Kenosis is a fancy Greek word that you learn in seminary, and it simply means emptying, a relinquishing, a releasing of power. And Paul could not be more clear that if we are to truly follow Christ, this is the posture we are to have: to empty ourselves of power, to release our privilege, to relinquish ourselves. Now, there is a plague that faces the Christian church and has for quite some time. A plague that prevents us from thoroughly living into the call of kenosis. I call it the plague of self-preservation. This idea that as we move through the world, first and foremost, our concern needs to be for ourselves, for our own survival. Self-preservation sits in complete odds with kenosis. And you see, at a very surface level, self-preservation can seem like a good thing. I mean, after all, it is written into our very biological code. Each and every one of us is genetically hardwired to ensure our own survival, to ensure our own preservation. But when we lean into self-preservation, when we turn our backs on the emptying of our own power, there is an incredible hidden cost. Some of you who may have heard me speak and present or preach over the years, you may have been introduced through story to my grandmother. My grandmother is the greatest woman who ever lived, incredibly the most influential woman in my life. And I have many, many stories about my grandmother that I have shared over the years. However, today I want to share with you a story that is not so much about my grandmother, but it is about a sacrifice that was made on behalf of my grandmother. You see, my grandmother was born in 1922. Shortly after she was born, her mother passed away. And so as a very young baby, my grandmother was sent to live and be raised by a relative. In the family, we know this relative by the name of Aunt B. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking Aunt B, like short for Beatrice. Spells her name B-E-A. No, don't be so foolish. This is Aunt B, literally the letter B, period. To this day, no one in the family knows what the B actually stands for. But she was just known as Aunt B. And my grandmother was sent to be raised by Aunt B. Now, Aunt B was deaf and mute. She could not hear, she could not speak. And so she found a way to navigate the world without those 2 points of connection, and made her way through a very rudimentary style of writing messages on scratch paper and forming some type of sign language. Not any formalized like American Sign Language as we have today, but just really, it amounted to tracing letters and shapes on the palm of hands, known only to her closest family. Now, Aunt B, for her employment, worked as the domestic help in a logging camp. These logging camps, another term that we use for logging camps, is man camps. You can imagine, as the only woman in this camp of anywhere from 35 to 50 men, you can imagine the unwanted, the vile attention that she would have received. I shudder to think of what extra duties Aunt B was forced to endure in this man camp. But this was the early 1920s. In the big woods of Wisconsin, there was not work for Indian people. And so Aunt B endured, took what she could. And now she's doing all of this with a baby. And so my grandmother was raised for the first few years of her life in a man camp in the big woods in the middle of Wisconsin. One day, as I was visiting with my grandmother, she was maybe 88, 89 years old. We were participating in our favorite activity, which was I would put her in the car, we would drive around, and she would tell me stories. We'd just go all over the reservation, story after story. And if you've ever driven through an area of what I call big woods, these areas that are targeted by industrial logging companies, you know what they look like. There is a main road. Sometimes it's paved, sometimes it's not, but there's a main road that is well traveled, and then coming off of these roads are what we call the logging roads. These are just areas where 75 to 100 years ago, the logging companies would use it and pull their tractors and trucks back there to haul the lumber out. And today, after decades and decades of not being used, these logging roads are completely impassable, but you can still see the vestiges of them as you drive through the woods. And on this particular day, I'm driving with my grandmother, and we pass where one of these logging roads comes into the main road, and she just, with all the nonchalance, as if she was telling you her favorite recipe, says, "Oh, down there is where we escaped from when I was a child." Hold on, what? I pulled over to the side of the road because you can't just say words like "we escaped from" and then not tell me what you're talking about. So I pulled over. I said, "Grandma, what are you talking about?" She said, "Down there is where we escaped from when I was a child." See, I did not know that my grandmother was raised for the first 4 or 5 years in her life in a logging camp, a man camp. And as Grandma unfolded this story for me, she told me that when she was about 4 or 5 years old, and you have to understand, the foreman of this logging camp was an incredibly angry, possessive man. One day, one night, in the middle of the night, as my grandmother lay sleeping, she was aroused to wake by Aunt B, and Aunt B quickly covered her mouth so that Grandma wouldn't alert, wouldn't scream out from shock and surprise. And in their secret sign language, Aunt B wrote, tracing letters and shapes in my grandmother's hand, and said, "It's not safe for you here anymore. I'm going to get you out." And she said that Aunt B loaded my grandmother's 5-year-old self on her back, carried her on her back as they made their way through the darkness and stillness of that night to escape from the logging camp. And the plan was to go to another relative's home where my grandmother could be raised in relative safety. And I said, "Grandma, how far did Aunt B carry you on her back?" And she said, "I'll show you. Keep driving." And so I checked the odometer of my car because I wanted to track this distance. I had to know how far it was. And as we drove and we continued to drive what seemed like an unbelievably long amount of time, Grandma told me how, because Aunt B was so fearful that the foreman of the logging camp would wake up and discover their absence, he would come looking for them. And remember, Aunt B is deaf. She cannot hear. So as a 4 or 5-year-old child, my grandmother, holding on to the back of Aunt B, had a very important job. Anytime my grandmother heard a car coming down the road, she would tap Aunt B on the shoulder to warn her of its approach, and they would then rush down into the ditch on the side of the road and pull the brush and the leaves over them to hide themselves from this man who was potentially coming to get them. And when it was safe again, they would crawl out of the ditch, and Aunt B would load grandmother on her back, and they would continue their journey. And on that drive that day, when we finally arrived at the ultimate destination for my grandmother, I looked at the mileage, and it was 6 miles. 6 miles my Aunt B carried my grandmother on her back. And on that day, I asked my grandmother, what happened next? In church, I must admit, I was no way prepared for her answer. Grandma, what happened next? Well, Aunt B Aunt B went back to the man camp. What? Are you kidding me? Why? Why, when you are this close to freedom, so close you can taste it? When your liberation is at hand, you have escaped the dangerous clutches of the foreman. Why, when you are free? Why would she go back? My grandmother's answer was as heart-wrenchingly impactful as it was simple. She looked at me. She said, well, it was 1926. We were Indians. I knew what she was saying. You see, there was a time in our nation's history for decades and decades when the families of American Indians was the targeted attack for separation and breaking of American Indian families. One of the primary tools that was used to break American Indian families and create this family separation was social workers. Social workers could come into an Indian family, deem the parents and caretakers unfit, and forcibly physically remove the child so that they could adopt this native child out to a white family. This happened with far too much frequency. During this time, between about the 1900s and the 1960s, it is said you could drive through native communities across the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. You could drive through cities, entire towns, and not see a single child because they had all been taken. And by 1926, in this part of the country, if you were a parent, if you were a Native American and you had a child, you only had at best a 50% chance of actually raising your own child. Half of our children were being taken away. The social workers visited frequently, just looking for a reason to remove these children. And one of the primary reasons why they would remove children from American Indian homes and families was if there was not proof of income to support that child. Aunt B had a horrendous job. A horrible job. But it was provable income. It was provable income. And so, faced with this decision to stay out of the logging camp, to grasp her freedom, and almost guarantee that my grandmother would be forcibly removed from the family, Aunt B emptied herself of that power. She emptied herself of that privilege of freedom. She emptied herself of self-preservation and chose to go back so that my grandmother would not be removed from her family and adopted into a white family. You see, so when I say that I stand here today, and if I see further than any other person, it's not because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants. No. I was carried on her back. You see, if Aunt B doesn't empty herself of that small sliver of power, my grandmother's story turns out very differently, and my story never sees the light of life. If Aunt B doesn't empty herself, if Aunt B doesn't lean into a word she never even heard of, if she doesn't lean into kenosis, this emptying, this relinquishing, this releasing, then I would not be standing here in front of you today. And so what? What do we do with this? How do we take Paul's message that our attitude should be that of Christ, who emptied himself, who had all the power and let go of it? How do we rid ourselves of the plague of self-preservation? Well, listen. As we, as a church, and I don't just mean this church, but I mean every church that claims to follow Christ, as we create programs, we need to not think about self-preservation, but we need to remember that as we create programs, we are carrying stories not yet written. As we as a church create budgets, now I'm stepping on some toes. Remember, you promised you would keep your drama to yourself. As we create budgets, you see, some churches, they write their budgets as if God doesn't own everything. They write their budgets as if God is just as scared of economic crisis as we are. They think that because we have been socialized into a scarcity mentality, that God, in God's self, is also afraid of losing resources. Nowhere in the narrative of Scripture does it say that God is worried. Nowhere. Behold the way he has clothed the lily of the valley. Will he not do the same for you? God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Why are we budgeting God's resources as if he's going to run out? God is not a God of scarcity. God is a God of abundance. But when we create our budgets, we close in on ourselves and we think about self-preservation. Some of us forget that a budget is a moral document. I can go into any church, I can go into any organization. I can open up their books, I can look at their budget, and within minutes determine what that church holds valuable. The budget, our programs, these are moral documents. They are public demonstrations of our values. So as we create programs, as we endeavor to write out our budgets, let us remember we are not called to self-preservation. We are called to obedience. Obedience unto death, if necessary, even death on a cross. That is the example of Christ. So as we endeavor into dreaming about our church's future, our church's financial stability, as we dream and project forward, let us have the courage to empty ourselves of self-preservation and dream about the stories not yet written. Thank you.